So when asking if aging is reversible, I just want to start with some fundamental questions, which is, I know it seems like a basic question, but how do you define aging? And that's broadly speaking across species, and also specifically in the context of humans, which I know a lot of people are interested in. I kind of have a fun game where I open up an engineering textbook and I look up definitions, and one of them is the definition of aging. And it usually is something like, well, aging is when things get old and decay. And then I look up old and decaying and reverts back to aging, right? So it's a very circuitous definition that's of no help. So I think maybe I'll turn to the speakers here, the participants on this panel, and just see if we can just tackle that first basic question before we start getting into the nuts and bolts of, is aging reversible?
Yeah. Well, okay, I'll go first. It is important to be rigorous about this, because so much of the confusion and the reason why there's still this debate about what aging is arises from people just, thinking about it the way they think about love or art, like you know it when you see it. It's like it's not good enough. So, I like to be systematic about this. I like to say, well, okay, aging is the process of getting biologically older, in other words, of increasing biological age. So, of course, that's only the first step. Then you've got to say, what is biological age? And to me, it is the amount of damage you have in the body. But then, in turn, you've got to say, okay, what is damage? Damage is, for this purpose, the molecular and cellular changes to the structure and composition of the body that are self-inflicted. In other words, they are consequences of the body's normal operation, and they are eventually bad for us once they get to a certain point. So that's the definition of damage. But the last thing you have to do is you have to say, well, okay, what is damage? Is it like, how do we know whether something is damage or not? How much of it we have? And of course, in general, we can't measure that accurately, or at least not comprehensively. So we measure proxies of it, like, epigenetic clocks and so on. And we have to always remember that these are proxies. These are approximations to the thing that we're really measuring, the biological age. If we have all of that, then the question of this panel, is aging reversible, becomes easier. But that's how I would define aging.
I think I'd call it the cumulative cellular and genetic damage due to our own internal processes and the environment. And I think that's the textbook definition. I think that a more recent, very, very important discovery of the process of aging is the contribution of the decay of the human immune system over time, that then results in most of the manifestations that we call aging.
Well, I also like to start with the definitions to be strict. I do agree that aging, in particular in humans, and by the way, I think everyone agrees here, lots of practitioners agree that we can revert aging in mice. We just don't know how many times we can do that. At least once, right, in an experiment. Lots of people have done that. So the actual question is how much we can revert aging in humans. So aging in humans, I agree that this is the damage. And this is the most nastiest form of damage. This is the damage in systems that are so good that they fail less than once in a lifetime. So that's why there are no biologically evolved mechanisms to control that damage. Nature doesn't care about damage that occurs not very often. So that's why I believe that there is a huge component in human aging that cannot be entirely reversed, but it could be stopped. That's my opinion.
Great. I really consider the definition of the biology of aging and biological aging in the lens of changes in systemic and local signaling that lead to a loss of tissue homeostasis. And importantly, the ability of our tissues in our bodies to both repair and regenerate, as well as maintain the overall health and integrity of cells within the tissue. And so this includes phenotypes such as the loss of our own precursor cells' ability to differentiate, and sometimes often not just cell death, but changes of differentiation towards certain lineages. For example, the bias that happens with aging in the immune system towards myeloid lineage, and a loss of the immune response and really the health of the immune system, as well as these changes in homeostasis leading to things like decline in our own mitochondrial integrity, metabolism, increase in systemic inflammation, DNA damage, and many other hallmarks that really are ultimately crucial towards maintaining tissue homeostasis that is lost with the aging process.
So I'm actually of the mind right now, this instant, that we don't have to be quite so quick to throw away the apparently tautological and useless definitions of aging. We could look at the one which says that aging is the increase in risk of death due to intrinsic causes over time, and say, well, what can we do with that? But the cancer community, cancer treatment community, seems to do quite well measuring their success in terms of how long these folk are living, i.e. what is their risk of death over time due to intrinsic causes doing. So if we just had a little more patience, we could probably do much the same thing for aging and measure the yardstick that way, and just punt the question of what aging is down to the people who are working at the lower level, and if they get something to work, then great, it fits your very arbitrary definition that ignores the mechanisms. But it's all about who gets it to work, and let the researchers argue about that.
So I can toss my 2 cents in here.
Eat the mic.
Eat the mic. So I can toss my 2 cents in here. So going back to what you used as an analogy before, Aubrey, when you're positing the idea of SENS, use the analogy of a car that breaks down over time. So damage accumulates. The reason we're able to maintain these vehicles on the road is because we have mechanics working on them, fixing them. Any damage that accumulates because of entropic processes can get repaired. However, in a biological system, or even in the system of the car, using that analogy, the mechanics themselves are also breaking down. So to me, fundamentally, it's what was mentioned earlier. I think you mentioned it, Hanadie, it's a breakdown of homeostasis. And so you fundamentally have to, so it's not just a general breakdown, but you have to have a breakdown of repair processes that cannot maintain that homeostasis anymore. Essentially, the mechanics themselves break down. And it's those mechanics that are the crucial operational part of maintaining that system. So that's... Yeah.
So I do want to come back on that a little bit, because the analogy with a car or with other simple man-made machines is all about the fact that in any machine, function is determined by structure. So yes, we can certainly say that aging is characterized by a breakdown in homeostatic power or whatever, and homeostasis, but that's really a kind of a readout, in the same way that lifespan or risk of death, mortality rate, is a readout. It's not really what we should be looking for if we want something predictive. If we want to know, have we done something that's going to allow someone to stay healthy for longer than they otherwise would in the future? That's what we really need. And so definitions based on structure and not on processes or outcomes are, I think, what we really need to drill down to.
Isn't it the case that the problem is we have all sorts of data, but we can't assemble it yet into the definitive, yes, this piece of data indicates that these processes happened in this order, and this process is more important than that process. The only way we can find out is by doing at this point in time. And as you point out, much of the present light and noise is how do we find out what the answer is without waiting 30 years? Hence why people are very excited about biomarkers of aging at this point.
The problem I see with dialing down on this is that many of the advances that we've seen have come from single cell work. So very particular genes that work in some cells and don't work in others, particular epigenetic changes, and the like. Mitochondrial dysfunction, and then there we can point to free radical production, right? So it's with very particular cells and very particular organelles, we have very particular hallmarks of aging and mechanism of action. But the problem that we have in translating this to a Gestalt question is the systemic one. What is it that's breaking down throughout the entire human, and what interventions could actually happen in the entire human? And again, I'll posit that the only work that currently exists in a systemic view for both delineating manifestations of aging, as well as an intervention, would be the immune system. Because all of your manifestations of aging are actually immune mediated. Muscle atrophy, vascular stiffness, neuroinflammation, metabolism, they're all immune mediated damage. Now, then you can look at, well, what in the immune system? That's a very difficult question. What's happening to the target organs in the muscle? That's also a difficult question, and you can see cellular mechanisms or interventions at that level. But to really tackle this, to Reason's point, in a systemic manner, something that can actually get to the whole beast, it's going to take a systemic approach rather than a very particular cellular approach like epigenetics or genetic changes, where you can't affect changes in 20 billion cells within you, but rather you could by monitoring the immune system and changing it.
Yeah, definitely. And I would definitely like to emphasize along the lines of what kind of Hans shared, that I really see the changes in protein signaling, right? Proteins being the actual, especially signaling secreted proteins, the biochemical messengers and the worker bees of our bodies that are in fact responsible for all phenotypic responses, from binding receptors on cells to induce immune responses, to binding receptors on stem cells to instruct them, what cell types to differentiate into. Really looking at changes in protein signaling and protein signal transduction, changes that happen both systemically in blood circulation, and we really saw the effects of things like parabiosis with systemic protein signaling changes. Changes in protein signaling and protein signal transduction can really be a great avenue systemically and locally in tissue microenvironments to actually target multiple hallmarks of aging and really target the messengers and the worker bees and the natural drug-like molecules of our body that are important for instructing phenotypes that could be considered rejuvenating or disease modifying or targeting hallmarks of aging.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay, so related to that question, what exactly do we mean when we speak about reversibility of aging, and to what degree, right? Do we have a system, when we reverse aging, there's a lot of different systems in the body. Are we referring to just one, so you can have reversal of skin aging, you can have different certain reversal of aging and kidney function, but are some of the therapeutics we're working on here potentially impact all systems throughout? Or are there some therapeutics that we're working on that can only affect the aging process in a certain subset of systems? So what do we mean by that, the reversibility of aging, when we talk about this?
Let's be reductionist for a moment, because why not? Aging is, you have molecules that are not in the right place, right? And if we want to be optimistic about these things, then rejuvenation is putting molecules back into their right place, or otherwise controlling systems such that they put molecules back into their right place. And optimistic about that, because if you look at the sweep of human technology throughout history, we're heading in the direction of control over where molecules are and what they're doing. So ultimately, yes, we will fix all of this. In the short term, you might look at me and say, that's a truly useless thing to say. How do I make my therapy work? And I say this really to point out the question of, okay, so in my company, what we do is we remove excess cholesterol from the body. Is that rejuvenation? It's certainly going to reduce death per unit time in the aged population. But some people might feel that this doesn't feel enough like rejuvenation. You're not really adjusting processes. You're not changing metabolism. You're literally just going in there and getting rid of some cholesterol that wasn't there in a young person. So is that rejuvenation? Is getting rid of senescent cells rejuvenation? Those molecules probably shouldn't have been where they were. And I think people are a lot more comfortable about that being more rejuvenation than the other. But that's a way to look at it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's appropriate to highlight a complication here that actually Vadim brought up in his talk this morning. We can certainly say, if we speak in a broad sense, just like generally, that reversing aging means restoring the structure of the body to something closer to how it was in early adulthood. So, in other words, reducing the amount of damage, where damage is defined in the way I defined it earlier. Fine. But that very clearly is a divide and conquer strategy. There are lots of different types of change that happen. And the thing that Vadim pointed out that I wanted to highlight is that some of those changes are adaptive. In fact, it's quite possible that most of those changes are adaptive. They are adaptations to other changes that are not adaptive, but finding out which ones are adaptive and which ones are not is very far from trivial. So it's perfectly possible that an incompletely comprehensive approach to restoring structure could actually have net negative effects, because you're eliminating the adaptations more than you're eliminating the things they were adapting to, if you like. And so we have to be completely comprehensive about it in order to be sure that it's going to work. But nevertheless, if we're talking about definitions, certainly we can say that rejuvenation or reversal of biological age is restoration of structure, simply coming from the fact that the body is a machine.
I'd add that so I agree with all this. I'm a firm believer that we need a multi-active ingredient or multiple therapeutics in order to affect something on the large scale of aging. When we look at what we know has very, very good irrefutable data in the clinic, we can look at genetic engineering. But those are very particular cells. You can't induce genetic engineering throughout the entire body. It's impossible. It can also be tumorigenic. We also know that epigenetic changes absolutely positively can affect aging. But there's another problem in that very particular manipulation, that it's also highly tumorigenic, and epigenetic changes on some cells are good, and on other cells they're very bad because of the diversity of the human. We can look at the mitochondria with free radical and oxidative stress. There is no way of getting at every cell in your body in order to change the mitochondria. You can look at portion reduction and starving yourself a little bit, which certainly does mean that you're going to live a little bit longer. There are lots of great data on that. However, not everyone's going to do it, and it also has some negative side effects. So we can go on and on. The problems with the current thinking and aging, I feel, are that they are more targeted, and they're definitely true with respect to a cell, or they're just not approachable because they just can't be administered to the entire body. So when you look at how we can actually affect this beast of aging, it's going to be multifactorial as a drug, or it's going to be multiple drugs. And regardless of what you call aging, in order to make your health span better, which is far, far more important than your lifespan, you're going to need a multi-active ingredient or a multiple of drugs. And again, broken record here, but I believe that the greatest work that's coming out of the aging field is in immune modulation, which you can do with secretomes, you can do with broad spectrum manipulation of early immune system cells.
Go ahead.
Yeah, definitely want to reiterate that I think it's going to be really combinatorial approaches that enable us to get true aging reversal, where single agent therapeutic interventions targeting specific mechanisms of action may be disease modifying, even rejuvenative, but they're not going to be fully rejuvenating, and it's really going to be identifying several factors that can really tip that balance more towards homeostasis by targeting multiple mechanisms of action that really lead to multiple hallmarks being improved, and then they're all interrelated. So you target a few of them, and suddenly you'll see that all of them eventually will go tip back in the right direction towards homeostasis.
If you like, I maybe comment to two of us. So first of all, if is aging reversible? In principle, of course, as reason said, in principle, why not? Laws of nature does not prohibit you from taking all the molecules, all the same molecules even probably, that used to work in your body when you were young at exactly the same positions. It's just a little bit expensive and maybe non-practical. So I think the question if something is possible should be confounded with the question if something is realistically possible, or for how much or for how long. So the next question is that, I like this analogy with the car. Of course, if we can service a car, we can change the parts, and different parts have different serviceability. So that's related to the equation of costs and time demands for the serviceability. So I think if we look at medicine as a car, at the human body as a car, we have certain systems that get sick very often. I mean, they change very often, and we change them. So when you have acute conditions, modern medicine can fix almost any acute condition. But when we have less serviceable parts, I mean, those systems that break once in your lifetime, these are called chronic diseases. I mean, influenza is not a problem, you can cure it. Even COVID, you can cure it. Within 2 years, you can have a drug and a vaccine. But if it's herpes, for example, you cannot cure it. If it's diabetes, you cannot cure it. So that basically tells you that there are certain parts in our cars that are less serviceable than other cars. It just takes more effort to service them. And on top of that, there are even less serviceable parts. So I think in practical terms, the question if aging is reversible or not condenses to this. Yes, there are lots of serviceable parts that we can service, we can rejuvenate them, we can extend our lifespan. Basically, if you can cure any chronic disease, your lifespan will increase by a little bit, right? I mean, that's what medicine is doing. By the way, medicine is extending our lifespan and somewhat rejuvenates us. People with diabetes that are taking drugs, or people with high cholesterol that are taking drugs, they're younger than they would have been. And by the way, cholesterol is a good aging clock, right? It predicts mortality, so this is a biological age reduction. So what I'm telling here is that in practical terms, like with an old car, if a car is very old and if it's not a collectible car, you will just throw it away and buy a new one. So in practical terms, there are practical limits on what kind of effort you are ready to spare for rejuvenation. And if we put this practical limitation, I would tell you that humans are unfortunately not fully age reversible, let's say, within finite time and finite effort.
From a practical point of view, of course, we don't repair all of our cars. We throw them away and get new cars. And while people don't like to think that that philosophy applies to other people, unfortunately, it seems to in the world in which we live in. But I agree. It should be perfectly possible, in theory, to repair a human and keep them going forever, just as we can do it for a car. It just won't happen. For most people, we would love to be able to get to a world in where it would cost 10 years of your life of work to keep yourself going for 100. And maybe that will happen, at which point a lot of people will live for a very long time, but for as long as it's expensive, it won't.
If you let me, of course I'm not asking to throw people under cars for the sake of this conversation. Obviously, humans are somewhat more valuable than cars. What I'm trying to tell you here that if indeed this argument of practical serviceability is correct, then maybe like with collectible cars, we should try to find interventions that instead of trying to fix all things that are not entirely serviceable, try to prevent breaks of those less serviceable parts in the future. So I think if we have, let's say, $100 million right now on the table and we have to decide whether we want to fund a super personalized intervention that is looking for ultra rare sources of damage in different cells and try to fix them. I mean, project A. And the other project that would possibly try to prevent most of those breaks in the future. I would, let's say, with the current technology, I would rather fund the project that would try to keep the body without defects in the future, rather than try to repair an unknown huge amount of practically unrepairable defects in the past. So what I'm saying is that this kind of a discussion should lead to some optimistic conclusion. And the optimistic conclusion here is that the aging science should provide interventions that let us stay healthier for a much longer time. And what I'm saying is that to repair the damage that has already occurred could be somewhat more challenging. So that's a matter of allocation of resources and personal optimism.
Yeah, the main difficulty that I have with what Peter just said is just being quite abstract about it, that we don't know which types of damage are practically irreversible or very, very hard to repair, simply because we don't know whether we've thought of all the ways in which we might go about that repair. It may be that, well, basically pioneering technology progresses in any field by people having creative ideas for new ways to do things more easily than we thought was possible before. And this has happened already within the past 20 years since I've been talking about rejuvenation. A very obvious example is that when I first presented the sense classification of damage, I said, okay, we've got to get rid of senescent cells. And I thought that we were going to have to do it with suicide gene therapy, with really sophisticated genetic mechanisms, which is not a stupid way of going about it. There's definitely people who are still pursuing that, and I think that's very good. But the point is we've also discovered in the meantime that there are drugs that seem to be reasonably selective at getting rid of senescent cells. And, I would not have dreamt that that would happen 20 years ago. And we're seeing this all over the place. We will continue to see it. So we must not be over-pessimistic about how difficult something is to repair. We can have hints as to how difficult something may be to repair, but we may be wrong.
And I think what the car analogy is really making me think of is, in addition to the axes of repair, meaning supplying certain molecules and genetic approaches, epigenetic approaches to convince basically the cells in our body to rejuvenate and to really restore and reverse hallmarks of aging, there's also the regenerative medicine approach, right? Where even doing things like, for example, taking bone marrow transplantations or hematopoietic stem cells from young healthy donors, organ transplantations, really the organ replacement approach could also be something that could really be paired, that regenerative medicine approach, with a lot of these therapeutic interventions that are also promoting your own body's cells and tissues to repair. And that could be something that could really maybe speed along the aging reversal theme.
Seems like if you reductio ad absurdum down to let's extract the brain and put it into a vat-grown body, is that actually rejuvenation? That seems like working your way around not having to do rejuvenation at all, or at least like outside the brain. But it's totally viable. There's certainly some groups thinking along those lines at this point.
It would definitely be along the lines of aging reversal, maybe not exactly rejuvenation, if the definition of rejuvenation is rejuvenating the cells that you were born with versus maybe getting cells transplanted or ex vivo applications that then get transplanted.
I think we can discourse on this all afternoon, but I think I'd like to turn the mics over to the audience and see if they have any questions for our panelists on this topic. Got a question way back there. Who's running the mics?
You're going to have to shout.
Somebody got a microphone back there? No, we got a mic coming, don't worry.
My question is basically, is the body actually a car, or is it not more something akin to like an ant colony where you have a bunch of cells and they have the ability to repair themselves or others, or like to commit suicide, etc. I think that the car analogy gets us only so far.
So I've been using this analogy for a long time, and so of course people have said this to me quite often. So my basic answer is that we must remember what we're doing with the analogy. The only extent to which I use this analogy is I say that the body's function is determined by its structure. And that is true for any machine, however sophisticated it is, however much automatic inbuilt self-repair it has, anything like that. So you're quite right that the body is very different, and indeed any living organism, or indeed any individual cell, is very different in specifics from any man-made machine, and the difference that it has its own self-repair or suicide programs or whatever is perhaps the single most conspicuous of those differences. But I don't think that that has any impact on the validity of the analogy in the way that I use it. Namely, structure is what defines function, and therefore restoration of structure will deliver restoration of function and prolongation of function.
Yeah. I think also your question really brings to the forefront the just critical importance, right, of intercellular and interorgan communication, where, it's not like things aren't siloed. It's really important to really look at what is causing a healthy communication between, for example, the blood and immune system and the brain, and how that change can actually drive aging of one another and every tissue in the body, or between muscle and the signals that the muscle actually secretes to, through the blood to other organs, and how when you rejuvenate one organ, you ultimately end up in many ways rejuvenating many other. So I think it's really looking also at that just importance between intercellular and interorgan communication, how we can systemically restore that. That is something we all have to consider in terms of truly age reversal interventions.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question from the audience. Sarah, right there in the center. Got a mic coming right towards you. Oh.
Thanks so much.
Sorry.
So I was wondering to what extent you think aging is, a unified pathway versus 10, 20, 40 different things that evolution has all put sort of in sync to happen at around the same time span. Because, I can think of some things that are obviously not linked, like DNA damage and the wearing down of my enamel. But how many sort of roots of aging do you think there might be?
Well, we all know what the right-hand side has in account right there, but I think the body does nothing in one way. Evolution loves reuse. Evolution loves producing large surface areas that map onto multiple underlying processes that are redundant in various ways. So it would be a surprise if aging turned out to be any different. In fact, the lists we have are probably a dramatic understatement. Nobody's yet added nuclear pore proteins to the list yet. And some of those, apparently, we keep our whole lives until they stop working. So I'm sure that the list that Aubrey and collaborators produced, and the list that the Hallmarks of Aging folk produced, and the Pillars of Aging list, and other lists that are out there, they will be added to as understanding increases. The closer we look, the more complex it gets.
Yeah, so, really, another way of phrasing your question is, what is the magnitude of the crosstalk between different processes? Because, sure, there are definitely different processes, and they are somewhat interconnected, and the question is how much? Certainly, a decade ago, when data started coming out on the benefits of eliminating senescent cells, back when the original work, of course, was with artificial genetic models, I think all of us, certainly I was astonished at how broad were the benefits that were seen. Way beyond, like when Judy Campisi first started saying, maybe senescent cells are actively toxic, not just useless, she was basically limiting her idea initially to the possibility that senescent cells might be oncogenic to cells right next door that were precancerous already. And we've seen that it's vastly broader than that. Indeed, one can go further. So in the combination experiment that LEV Foundation is doing right now, which I guess most of you know about, we chose the interventions with a number of criteria, of course, but the number one criterion was that they had individually shown some respectable increase in mean and maximum lifespan starting late in life in mice, in regular wild-type mice. Now, you can't get that unless you have a lot of crosstalk, a lot of knock-on effects from the intervention, from hitting everything somewhat. And of course, we chose our interventions to be diverse, so as to capitalize on that. But I think what we can certainly say now is that the magnitude of that crosstalk is much bigger than most of us would have said 10, 15 years ago.
Okay, excellent. So I think, unfortunately, we're at time right now. And this question here, we certainly could spend the rest of the day arguing and diving deeper and deeper. But for that, we're going to have to make way for the speakers. So I thank all the panelists. Thank everybody in the audience for the questions. And we'll move on to our speakers. Thank you.